These are some of the worst All-Stars in NBA history. And to start things off, let's look at Kyle Korver. Don't get me wrong, Korver was a master of his craft. At his peak, he was shooting above 50% from 3, which is pretty damn ridiculous in any way you want to look at it. But when he was selected to compete in the 2015 All-Star game, he made himself a poster boy when it comes to some of the worst All-Stars of all time. Although they may have been the most efficient 12 points per game you've ever seen, they were still 12 points per game. And that's really all he brought to the table. I mean, at a time where the three-point revolution started to hit full swing, Kyle Korver was the best non-warrior in the NBA when it came to shooting the ball. And as the league began to really see the value in what he brought to the team, his All-Star selection may have been a bit of overreacting to a guy who wasn't even a 3-and-D guy, but just a full-on three-point specialist. Now, to give him a little bit more credit, he was a reserve for Dwayne Wade, who was unable to play, and there really weren't that many guards in the East that were putting together stellar seasons. The conference was just weak altogether. But when you put him alongside All-Stars, he's the outlier. When a guy like LaMelo Ball this season doesn't make the game, averaging 27, 5, and 7, you look back at guys like Korver and wonder how the hell did he get in there? It was more of a team achievement than a personal one. This was just kind of the year to do it. With team success and a kind of soft conference, the Hawks had been tearing up the league prior to the All-Star game as one of the best regular season teams of the decade, with players that were just above average at every position, and people believed that the Hawks deserved all of the credits and the hype that they could get, and that's where Kyle Korver came in. Now, by the time he made it, he was already 33 years old, so it should come as no surprise that he wouldn't touch an All-Star game ever again, which helps him go down as one of the oddest and maybe least deserving players to ever play in the game. At close to 50-50-90 shooting, when it comes to just doing the job you're paid to do, Kyle Korver was certainly a star in his role. But on a feel-good Atlanta Hawks squad, this raised the question about whether All-Stars and role players could fit in the same sentence. It's not that he wasn't valuable to the team, because he no doubt was, but All-Stars are usually expected to be the leaders of the team, not role players who benefit from the system they're playing in. Next up, we've got Chris the Caveman Kaman, who was able to squeeze his way into a 2010 All-Star appearance, replacing an injured Brandon Roy. That season, Chris Kaman was leading the Clippers and putting up career highs. There wasn't really any centers doing it better than him that season. He averaged 18.5 points, 9.3 rebounds, and 1.6 blocks per game. But his issue was that he wasn't exactly efficient for his position. He only shot 49% from the field as a big guy, and he wasn't exactly leading a winning team either, as the Clippers were 21-28 going into the break. But perhaps the most disappointing part about his All-Star appearance were the players that were snubbed because of him. A 28-year-old Carlos Boozer, who averaged 19 and 11 on 56% shooting as a better defender, didn't get in. A prime Monte Ellis, who averaged 25.5 points per game that season, wasn't given the opportunity either. But you can't put that on Kaman, who was put in the game due to his position, but Monte at this time, and pretty much every other time, was just so much better than Chris Kaman. As the NBA record holder for most 20-point games without ever scoring 30 points, he's just Mr. Good, not great, who had an outlier season averaging 18 when for his career he was typically around 10 to 13 a night. Among true pure centers, Kaman was the best you were going to get, I guess. He was a solid player, but definitely nothing special, and his selection could definitely be chalked down as filling the spot rather than being the best overall player for the spot, which is why fans saw his selection as undeserving and more so underwhelming. After that season, Kaman would have a catastrophic fall-off, although injuries played a role, but the point still is that he never made it back to that spot ever again. He made one boom in the NBA, which he made the All-Star team, which is kind of hilarious, which, given that his efficiency declined, appears to just be inflated stats from playing on a bad team. But nonetheless, he was awarded for his serviceable career with an All-Star selection, which kind of rules, I guess. He would continue to be a decent big man, but he would never reach the level of play which got him to the All-Star game again, or even get close to it. But now, we're going to look at the Hall of Famer Yao Ming, who was an anomaly at his peak. Due to the loves that fans had for him over in China, Yao would be selected as the starting center in each of his 8 years in the league, including his first and his last. When you look at his stats, year after year, one of them is especially not like the other. You could argue that his rookie season didn't warrant an All-Star appearance, and you'd probably be right. But the NBA sure loved it either way. They had found a player to bring the untapped potential of the Chinese fan base, and they were banking on it. But the year I want to zero in on would be his final one. While he didn't end up playing in the 2011 All-Star game due to injury, he was still selected. But here's the craziest part. He only played 5 games that season and only got 18 minutes per game in runtime. On paper, this would definitely be the worst All-Star season of all time, but it just isn't that simple. He made it on a technicality. It didn't matter how poorly or how little you played. If you got enough votes from fans, you were in. And I guess it also helped that he was going up against Nene and Andrew Bynum as his top competition in All-Star voting, but really, there's little way to justify this in any way, shape, or form. He would be replaced, of course, by Kevin Love, but it exposed the flaws in the system. Because of this incident, and when fucking Zaza Pachulia almost became a starter, the NBA tweaked the voting structure so that players couldn't get in on fan votes alone, which means that we will never see another occurrence of this ever again. So when fans are angry at the NBA for the LaMelo Ball All-Star snub this season, despite his fan vote count, they can point to this as a reason why they didn't get to see him in action. But when it was all said and done for Yao, he had put up a legendary career both on and off the court as an ambassador for the game. His name is now in the Basketball Hall of Fame, and while his 100% All-Star percentage is definitely flawed, it should not take away from the kind of player that he was. Next up, we have James Donaldson, who was an injury replacement for Steve Johnson in the 1988 All-Star game. But in hindsight, he was nowhere near All-Star material. It was another moment where the lack of center depth in the league was at full display. He averaged 7 points and 9 rebounds per game. I mean, that's like if Clint Capella or Gorgie Drang made it today. It just wouldn't happen. This guy is below average to average. His efficiency was okay, but if your job is to dunk the ball and get putbacks, you need to be efficient or else somebody else is going to step up. I said that there's a lack of centers that were All-Star worthy. While that's certainly true, it's not like there weren't other centers doing more this season. Benoit Benjamin was averaging 13 and 8 in LA. The most improved player that season, Kevin Duckworth, averaged 16 and 7, but at least he could get the nod the next year. Donaldson's selection showed once again the difficulty certain years of filling the center position at the All-Star game. Traditional centers were essential. They were all kind of the same at one point in time, outside of the few exceptions that we all remember. They were big guys who could be bruisers down low and put the ball in the basket when they needed to. There wasn't much to it, and there wasn't much variety either. The system was flawed. It was as simple as that. While it may not be as big of a problem in today's game where a lot of the top guys are big men, it posed real challenges back then with the lack of diversity. But let's take a break from the center position and look at Mo Williams, who was LeBron's second-hand man en route to his only All-Star appearance in 2009. Statistically, he had a pretty good year, averaging nearly 18 points per game and shooting 43% from behind the arc. But apart from his efficient scoring, he really wasn't doing anything. For a point guard, his assist levels were low at 4.1 per game, but it wasn't like he was a dog on defense with a defensive rating of 104. When you break it all down, it seems like a team achievement over an individual one. The Cavs were the top dogs in the East because of LeBron James, with a record of 39 and 9 at the time. Mo was a good teammate because he let LeBron do his thing. I mean, LeBron was basically the entire team. With LeBron on the court, the Cavs had a plus 15 offensive rating, but off the court, they had a minus 6.2 rating, a 21.2 difference. Meanwhile, Williams had just a 3.4 difference. It's almost like LeBron was so good that he got 2 All-Star spots. Williams didn't even get the spot in the first place, but after Chris Bosh was ruled out of the game, Mo was given the spot instead with some help from his teammates who were upset that they thought he was snubbed. But was he? I mean, if it weren't for LeBron, Williams' names would have never been in All-Star conversations, and after he left LeBron's side, his name surely wasn't mentioned in any more. Mo Williams was a good player in the NBA, don't get me wrong. He certainly had a better career than most with a scoring ability that made him a starter level for quite a while, but it was quite elite between that and an All-Star player, which a lot of people agree was just too big to actually make. His All-Star selection was an odd one. His team deserved the praise, but his team was in all honesty just 95% one guy, while Mo benefited from being the number 2 guy, while the number 1 was a playmaker without many other options. Now, another guy from the LeBron era who was given a nod in the East was Roy Hibbert in both 2012 and 2014. During these selections, Hibbert held it down on the defensive side of the ball, while young Paul George and a prime Danny Granger took over on the other ends, and had his name in Defensive Player of the Year conversations, yet many people struggled to believe that his All-Star selections were really that impressive. In his first All-Star season, he averaged 12.8 points, 8.8 rebounds, and 2 blocks per game. And in his second, he averaged 10.8, 6.6, and 2.2. These numbers, in all honesty, don't even matter. Roy Hibbert's value just came in rim protection, and that's it. There was nothing else anywhere close to elite in his game, and nothing I'd even say that probably meant average level. He took advantage of the verticality rule, which meant as long as the defender jumped straight up and down and not into a defender, he was safe from the whistle, which frustrated people greatly. Roy was a giant and could clog the lane as well as anybody, and with a very elite defensive squad that funneled shots straight to him, this size and rim protection selection created one of the best defensive teams since the Pistons in 2004. For a center, he was what any team would want for a brief while, and at 27, many people thought he could keep up that same level of play, but we all know that just wasn't the case at all. We could start off looking at his shitty playoff performances, which included a couple of 0.0 rebound games, and when he left Indiana, he literally fell off a cliff. He went from being a two-time All-Star to averaging 6 points per game as a 29-year-old in Los Angeles. At the end of the day, the East was dog shit, we all know that, and Hibbert was pretty much the best you could find. He was so good at one thing, which was so crucial to the Pacers' success, that the league looked at him as a star, while given how much better bigs are today, and how catastrophic his fall-off was, this one's easy to point out as one of the worst All-Stars of his time. Shaq's final All-Star selection in the 2008-2009 All-Star season showed off the problems with evaluating former superstars in the NBA and what realm they really were in. While his numbers for the 2009 All-Star game were not by any means bad at 18 and 8, O'Neal still made the team largely off of reputation and memories. But after Al Jefferson was snubbed while averaging 23 and 11, people started to debate whether Shaq's All-Star appearance was earned that season or in his glory days with the Lakers. Of course, players should be respected and recognized for their past success, but should that come at the expense of younger guys who may be doing it better? That was the problem. Shaq's All-Star season wasn't exactly undeserved, but it brought up those kinds of questions nonetheless. He would go on to win co-MVP alongside former teammate Kobe Bryant, which made for great narratives for obvious reasons, and would earn an All-NBA third-team selection by the end of that season. But that would be the last hurrah for Shaq, as he would exit the league after 2 more stints with 2 more teams in pretty ugly fashion. His inclusion in the All-Star game seemed to be based off memories of his prime, and we all know how dominant Shaq was. But at the end of the day, it entertained fans on All-Star Weekend as they got to see one of the best bigs to ever do it compete in the All-Star Weekend for one last time. So can we really be too mad? Now, Wally Szczerbiak was an extremely solid role player in the 2000s. He would get his time in the All-Star game in 2002 after a very solid year with the Timberwolves, where he averaged 18.7 points and 4.8 rebounds per game while shooting 45% from 3, and was a very solid second option to a terrifying Kevin Garnett. But when he was selected, there was some speculation because his game didn't have much diversity. People saw him as a one-dimensional player who could do one thing: score. He was a very efficient scorer, but that's all he brought to the table. He wasn't there to be a star, he was there to get buckets. Had he replicated this season time and time again, people may think of him in a different light. Superstars can normally get away with getting into the All-Star game with numbers like that because they are who the fans want to see. But Szczerbiak never made it back. And although not the worst robbery in the world, and maybe not even one at all, as a Wolves fan who briefly remembers Szczerbiak back in the day, he's one of those underrated guys you just don't expect to see at All-Star Weekend. He would keep his role as a reliable scorer for many more years, and became a true team player, even coming off the bench for a good while. But then, injuries caught up to him. First he hurt his knee, then his ankles, he would get surgery multiple times, and never come back the same. Because of those, his All-Star selection has gone down as a curious footnote in the history books. Just 1 year prior to Wally's selection, Theo Ratliff found his way into the All-Star game alongside his teammate Allen Iverson. Ratliff was a good defensive anchor, leading the league in blocks with nearly 4 per game, but wouldn't get to play after a season-ending injury, sidelining him just before the All-Star game. But offensively, he was kinda trash. He wasn't efficient, especially for a big man. He shot just below 50% from the floor, but at least he had shot blocking abilities, right? It seemed like Ratliff had reached his peak, averaging the same numbers year after year, but his career was cursed after he was selected for the All-Star game. After being selected for the team, the Sixers decided it was time to move on from Ratliff, as they had just gotten Dikembe Mutombo on their squad. But in the first season with his new team, Ratliff would only play 3 games due to injury. He would come back the next season as a shot blocking threat once again, but his offensive efficiency had gone down even further. He was consistently in the conversation for Defensive Player of the Year, but it came with a cost. And after being moved to the Trailblazers after his time with the Hawks, Ratliff would suffer more injuries and miss a decent chunk of games year after year. His career slowly dwindled after 9 teams in 16 years. He was a defensive presence, but looking back on it, his team success combined with his defensive dependency was ultimately why he was selected for the game. Remember that Kyle Korver selection? Well, he wasn't the only Atlanta Hawk that year who was given an All-Star spot that might not have been the most deserving of it. That year, their point guard Jeff Teague would get a spot of his own, and not as a replacement. He was a solid point guard throughout his career, and averaged 15 and 7 in his All-Star season, and would feast in passing lanes with 1.7 steals per game, even though all in all, his defense was kinda trash, as he'll tell you. His numbers were good, not great. They were respectable by any means, but nowhere near All-Star worthy just on paper. He was a decent scorer that was fast and a bit inconsistent in terms of shooting and facilitating. But with the pieces set in the system around him, he was set up for success. Need I remind you how nuts this Hawks team was though? They were 43 and 11 going into the All-Star break. They They didn't win by having a superstar, and so I guess it was tricky to decide who was all-star worthy outside of Al Horford, so they just gave it to all 4 of their main guys, which kind of makes this look a little rough looking back at it. But Teague's selection meant that some more talented players were going to be snubbed. You could make a case for Brandon Knight or even a young Nikola Vucevic. When it comes down to it, Teague was still a very solid player for quite a while. He was the point guard for the top dog in the East and led a team that people thought would finally beat LeBron, and while it didn't, the players still deserve some recognition for what they were able to do in those seasons. But if the question becomes whether or not he should have been an all-star, a lot of people are going to say no, as he was seen as another team success merchant that year rather than by his individual prowess. But at least this podcast is cool, so this one's pretty chill, I guess. When you talk about players past their primes that made all-star selections based on popularity rather than their play, Kobe being Bryant is usually on that list. Kobe's impact on the league was undeniable. He changed the game. His poster is still on my childhood bedroom wall, and I bet a lot of you watching can say the same. His 5 titles, 18 all-star appearances, and 15 All-NBA selections are a testament to how great of a player this guy really was. But as much as I hate to say it, a couple of those all-star appearances at the end of his career were not really the most deserving. First off, you have the obvious one. In 2014, where like Yao Ming, Kobe barely played after tearing his Achilles tendon and fracturing his left knee, his season was cut short after just 6 games. But that didn't mean that fans weren't going to put his name on their all-star ballots. He was voted in as the second backcourt player alongside Steph Curry as a starter, but of course, he didn't play due to injury. Then there's the case of his final season in 2016. While his farewell tour was bittersweet, his production on the court was obviously not his best. He averaged 18 points per game, but on a crazy low 35% shooting. And to make matters worse, the Lakers were miserable with a 17-65 record that made them the last seed in the West. And if you hadn't guessed it already, he was given the All-Star selection as a starter after receiving almost 2 million votes, nearly 300 more than Steph Curry, who got the second most. But during his final appearance, there were a few players left out, most notably All-NBA second team member Damian Lillard, who was dropping 25 a game. I mean, this is kind of highway robbery, but even with all of this, it's pretty hard to make a case against Kobe Bryant in an All-Star game. He meant too much to the sports, and that's kind of why Kobe Bryant's farewell showing doesn't really feel that wrong. But when people talk about the worst All-Star players in NBA history, a lot of people point at Jamaal Magloire. Selected as a reserve in the Eastern Conference for the 2004 All-Star game, Magloire averaged 13-10 for the New Orleans Hornets. The numbers weren't bad, I guess, but they weren't memorable at all. I talk about basketball for a living at this point, and I don't know who the fuck this guy, who the fuck is this? So how did he get here? Well, it should come as no surprise that the East lacked center depth, as it always did, and so Magloire was the one who swooped in. I mean, with how many Eastern Conference centers there are in this list, we should kind of put an asterisk on like all these guys who made it in that era, because more often than not, you'd have a guy like Magloire who made it solely based on position. But the funniest part of it all was that he came pretty dang close to becoming the All-Star MVP, actually leading his team with 19 points and 8 rebounds, and could have made a serious case for himself had the East actually won the game. His All-Star selection would be his peak. A finger injury would sideline him for a big chunk of the next season, and he would become an NBA journeyman after that, finishing his career after playing for 8 teams in 12 years. When you ask a regular person who Jamaal Magloire is, many people would look at you like a fucking idiot. He was a random selection and has become the touchstone for random and undeserving All-Stars. His selection also sparked debates surrounding the positional requirements around the All-Star game. Now, rather than having a set center, you just need front court or backcourt players, and guys like Jamaal Magloire are part of the reason why that's the case. Jameer Nelson has been considered one of the worst All-Stars the league has ever seen after he was selected for the 2009 All-Star game. He was a sidekick to a dominant Dwight Howard, and was given the selection alongside both Howard and another teammate, Rashard Lewis. He was a key contributor to the Magic's success that season, averaging 16.7 points and 5.4 assists. And at the time, yeah, the Magic were killing it. So why shouldn't they reward him with 3 spots? Unfortunately, Jameer Nelson was ruled out for the All-Star game due to torn labrum, and would be replaced by Ray Allen, who many people thought was snubbed as he was a huge piece of a successful team as well. He wouldn't be back in action until the finals against the Lakers, but didn't do too much. However, Magic fans were excited to see what their All-Star point guard could do in the following years. After all, at just 26 years old, he was already an All-Star. Surely he would only be getting better, right? Well, not exactly. He wouldn't fall off, but he never got better either. Year after year, he would prove that he could be reliable and get the ball to Dwight Howard. But after Dwight left, the Magic sucked. They went from winning 56% of their games to 24% just because Howard left. I mean, kinda like Mo Williams, Jameer was an accessory piece. He wasn't All-Star level talent-wise, but on the Magic team that had maybe the best pick-and-roll threat ever outside of Karl Malone, Jameer could shoot pull-up threes off of on-ball screens and pass the ball well enough to find D12 rolling or any open shooter on the perimeter. And that was literally all that Orlando needed to be elite. When you take all of that into account, you look at his All-Star appearance in a different light. He was given the spot because a prime Dwight Howard carried his team to success, but if not for that, Jameer would have never touched All-Star level. B.J. Armstrong's All-Star season came with the Chicago Bulls in the year following Michael Jordan's retirement. As expected, the Bulls were looking for players to step up in the absence of, at the time, their 3-time MVP and superstar, and Armstrong was one of those guys. Once Michael left, he had more of an opportunity to show off his game. His stats were decent, but not by any means amazing. He averaged 15 and 4 as the sidekick to the GOAT's sidekick and Horace Grant. But that didn't matter. The basketball world loved the Bulls with or without MJ, and so when it came time to vote, BJ received the second most votes amongst all Eastern Conference players with 529,000, which earned him the starting point guard spot in the big game. It once again showed off the unique yet flawed voting system from back in the day. There were other guys that were doing it better than him, like Mark Price or Kenny Anderson, but that didn't matter. Chicago Bulls fans were going to get their guys into the game whether or not it was deserved. After this appearance, Armstrong's career would gradually decline. After one more year with MJ, he would go into an expansion draft unprotected and end up playing for Golden State. He would transform into a backup point guard and would see his roles diminish until his time in the league was over in 2000. But his selection remains an interesting piece to the Bulls dynasty. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, subscribe if you're new. We're trying to hit 100,000 this year, and I'll see you boys in the next one. Peace out.